we need to learn that actually our morality progresses as we go forward, and there is something deeply positive about the fact that if somebody says, yeah, this what I did 20 years ago was acceptable then, and I'm really pleased that it's no longer is.
This is The Strategy Behind with Adam Cox, Jutta Tobias Mortlock and Matt Wilkinson. In this episode, we explore the strategy behind morality in leadership.
Ladies and gentlemen, we bring to you today the strategy behind morality in leadership. And morality is a topic that we can explore from all sorts of angles and perspectives. We could talk about what drives morality, and we could talk about the consequences of moral or maybe not so moral actions. And let's see where we get with this. My first question for you gentlemen here really today is, what is a moral and what is an immoral action before and after you do it?
Ooh, well, I mean, I think that depends on the culture of the group that you're in. Morality is, as far as I understand it, is best described as a code of conduct put forward by a society or a group. It could be religious, it could be a business, it could be the community in which you live, it could be the political system in which you operate, and therefore there are a number of codes and norms that people abide by, and therefore a moral action is one that conforms to those norms, and an amoral one is one which breaks them. Now, what exactly a moral action is or not, I mean, that's going to depend on the group in question. Amongst the three of us, there are certain norms and ways that we interact with each other, and we've always set up a safe space to discuss. If all of a sudden I start turning around and attacking one of you guys, or you start attacking me, that would be an amoral action as part of this group. But actually, if you go to the internet, that's very, very almost accepted behaviour. Sort of trolls attacking people. It's frowned upon, but it's commonplace.
I think it's really interesting as you're speaking that I couldn't agree more, Matt. And I'm thinking that quite often we only realize what morality means after the fact. That, if you were to start to behave in a way that Adam and I find completely unacceptable, we only really know what is completely unacceptable after you've done it. So it's quite a difficult thing to become clear about before it gets tested. Before boundaries get tested. What do you think, Adam?
Yeah, firstly, it has to be subjective, to Matt's point, is that it's content and context dependent. So if I then kind of take it a level of abstraction higher, morality would have to be born from the relationship between experience and knowledge. And with your experience of what you know to be true and your knowledge of what you think and how you think about it, you'll form beliefs, assumptions, moral positions, all of these kind of abstract kind of constructs of thinking, of which morality falls into those. And so I think there's also some morality will be more definitive and less ambiguous, like a code of conduct. And then there'll be the moral stance around principle and purpose, which is unspoken but potentially commonly understood, or sometimes quite frequently misunderstood. So it's almost like asking the question, what is the difference between right and wrong, and be explicit. I've been asked that question. I was on a panel and someone said, well, define right. And I'm like, are we really going to open this? Because it's a complex question with an incredibly complex answer, and it's very difficult to answer. However, when we look at morality, and particularly morality, if we start at morality with leadership, because I think the position that a leader holds and the morality that he or she demonstrates casts a shadow over what morality may be for others. Like there's, whether it's religious scripture, whether it's the CEO, whether it's the president, there's a weight, there's a kind of a credibility weighting that comes with what is morally correct, and then how that is permeated through communities of individuals. I think morality can be taught, I think, is where my brain is starting to go as a starting point. Would you agree that morality is kind of a transferable system or belief?
And I think it's a lot, you said experience and knowledge or something, right? And the word wisdom comes to my mind as well here when you were speaking in principles. Yeah. And I think the word experience, I think, is a really big word. I have a story that comes to my mind when I listen to you. Am I still stable? It says my internet connection is a bit unstable. Can you hear me okay?
You're coming through loud and clear on this end.
Fantastic. So I listened to the story of a really impressive Royal Marine colonel that I've met a few years back. His name is Tony Derea. He took over with somebody else running the Abu Ghraib prison in 2004, a year after the atrocities in the Abu Ghraib prison made world news. And he talked about how the decisions that he had to take to bring back order to running the prison, as well as actually treating everybody fairly, and with the International Court of Justice watching whatever actions they were doing. And the way he explained how he went about listening to the different perspectives of the people who were running the prison, as well as doing walkabouts and having audiences with the actual prison inmates, to me that ended up sounding like somebody who knows what's right and what's wrong, and who knows what fairness means in treating people independent of what you think of them. And in that way, to me, he created a story of what morality looks and feels like by listening to different perspectives, by not being swayed too quickly, by taking a step back before judging, and by being fair to everybody in the question. And so I found that a really impressive story of leadership. And today we're talking about morality. So what connections can we make between morality and leadership here, really?
Yeah.
So I'd like to jump in here a little bit, because I think you've opened up a couple of avenues, for me at least. The first is where did he learn that his sense of right and wrong, which comes down to the codes of conduct that he was brought up with. And secondly, I think there is then the question of how can morality be perverted? And when I say that, you've got something like the Stanford Prison Experiment, where you had a group of people walking into an experiment to look at, do you have prisoners and guards? And when they walked in, they were all the same group. They were all peers. There was no differences between them. And very quickly the experiment had to be stopped, because the guards were mistreating the prisoners. And when you start looking into that, it goes to show that really the question of us and them and the separation of groups can cause very, very insider-outsider effects as to what the morality is for the group within the group and the morality for those outside of the group. And I think what you're touching on there is the fact that actually, because you had that sense of these are prisoners, they're here for a reason, and they've probably done some really, really horrific things, and then the guards themselves have ended up losing their sense of morality as to the way they should behave, partly because of what's gone on and partly because of the things that they've seen prior to moving into those situations. So for me, it looks at where do we learn our morality, and then actually how is that shaped by the groups that we're actually part of. And it's almost a danger of being part of it, single unit groups that don't have enough connection to the wider world, that I would say causes these incidences. You know, doesn't community set up checks and balance? Go for it.
Thank you. Matt, you've just raised something that I think is incredibly important, and that allowed me to understand a little bit more about morality and, you know, the roles that I have in life and the identity that I have. Like, who am I, right? And what does that mean for my actions and for how I judge situations? And it sounded to me a little bit like, if I think about, you know, Abu Ghraib, you know, British Royal Marines having to run it after it's been, you know, it's a mess. And this colonel had to almost make his personal suspending of judgment more important than the role that he had, or the kind of the identity of, I'm running this prison and the prisoners are, you know, at my mercy, really. So I'm gonna just say this again and see if that rings true for you. So my morality almost needs to be higher than the roles or the allegiances or and I think so my identity needs to be less attached to who's my friend and who's my foe, and it needs to be of a higher order, because otherwise it goes down the drain and it's immoral, because my roles in life or my allegiances to you might make me say yes to something that you say, even though in my heart of hearts I don't actually believe it, because we're friends.
Okay. So what we're getting to is that morality is malleable.
Yeah.
It's malleable based on circumstance, and it's malleable based on context. Okay.
But should it be malleable?
Yeah, so here we go. So let's kind of dig a little bit deeper. I was listening to a podcast on some random clickfest a while ago. I ended up on a podcast by a Muslim cleric, and he was talking about kind of your principles of the faith, and I like learning stuff, so off I go. And there's one line that he said that's coming forward. Unfortunately, I can't remember his name, but he was talking about the singularities of the faith, and dedicate yourself to God in service, and these different things. And then the interviewer asked him, inside the individual, what is the singularity to you as an individual when it comes to your faith? And he said, ultimately, to me, in a personal capacity in the chest, Islam is about the quality of heart. I thought, oh, that's interesting. The quality of heart. So we're kind of moving towards, in a corporate perspective, I would call it purpose. In a political context, I would call it service. And in a kind of a social construct, it would probably be a little bit looser, something like, doing good, or, treat others the way you expect to be treated, and these sort of things. It's almost like thinking about it in first principles, like boil it down. So if morality is malleable, at what point in time does your own personal moral compass then start to say, hey, no, I'm not going to take that line, or I'm not going to adopt to the morality of the group, or whatever it happens to be? So I think there's kind of different points of morality here. There's the morality within the individual, and then the morality of a collective of people, whether it be through culture or social or geopolitical or whatever. I think what we're doing at the moment is we're starting to unpick the different flavors of morality. And I think, given the fact we're kind of going down the path of the morality of leadership, understanding where that morality is born, where it's kept, who gets to change it. It's these sort of questions. I want to see if we can sink our teeth into the mechanics behind morality, because if we understand its mechanics, if we think about it in a first principles perspective, we should then be able to architect a good moral framework for how to live, how to lead, how to do whatever it happens to be. I don't know if my thinking is kind of on track or not, though. What are you hearing?
I think it is, Adam. You got me thinking about, and I think you raised this a while ago in one of our previous conversations. But it got me thinking how actually morality is molded by our circumstances as a group. So as a world, as an interconnected world, and as a group of people that tend to interact with people from around the world, from all different natures, cultures, creeds, we have a fairly global outlook on life, and therefore our morals probably tend to be set as a group on this call by those that are to the highest level across the world, right? So we are, our set of moral standards will be kind of that amalgamation of hopefully the best of the people that we interact with. If we were then set to, hopefully, if we were then isolated, let's just say in the middle of a desert or the middle of a rainforest, and you've got a small group of people, the imperative is to survive. And there are tribes out there that when when people from the Western world or the rest of the world have seen how they operate, their moral compass is very different. So while in the West we have a general philosophy of leave no one behind, in some of those tribes, actually you would kill the weakest, because for the survival of the tribe, you can't afford to have the weak holding up the rear, and therefore the morality is what is best for the community as a whole. And so that's been set up, that moral imperative has probably been learned over time as, if we don't do this, we all die, or a lot of us die, and if we do this, there's we can move quicker, faster, we're more nimble, and we survive. And so therefore the morality in that situation becomes very different to what we would experience, where the most difficult thing we tend to deal with on a day-to-day basis is, oh no, we're working from home because of COVID and our Wi-Fi's down, right? The moral imperative in those situations is completely different. And actually, what are we doing to help the survival of those in the country right now? We're staying at home and doing as little as possible, which is kind of bizarre, right? So if you sort of look at those two examples of where is the moral imperative set at, it's about survival of the tribe and what's best for the group of people that we interact with. In isolation, that becomes, I think, can become very distinct from the greater group. But with more contact and greater connectivity, we end up with something that is much more normalized across societies as a whole.
I was interested to see how long it would take before a moral dilemma came up. And it took, 15 minutes? So that's not bad. So yeah, completely, your point has elevated that quite clearly. I think it's interesting in relation to your point around survival. And I put it in a business context for a moment. And the saying that instantly lunges forward, which I've said before, the company will always act in its own best interest. And I believe that to be definitively true. What its best interest is context dependent. I'll give you a great example. Current pandemic that we're in, many organizations are in survival mode. I get that. I was talking to a mid-sized organization in the States, 1,000 employees, been working with them over a couple of months, and their mission critical, like their bottom line, what we must achieve now was we must keep everyone on the payroll. That was the definitive objective. We must keep everyone on the payroll. This is the States. They wanted to keep everyone with healthcare cover during the pandemic. And it was interesting. It's like, okay, so fine. How are you going to enable this amongst your stakeholders? And interestingly, I wasn't aware of this when I was helping him, but a third of the company is employee owned. So the business model enabled a moral position to be taken. So the way I'm thinking about, Matt, what you just said is how, when you define survival is usually a definition around a purpose. Is it financial survival? Is it my own personal reputational survival? Is it the survival of our employees in practical terms? Like, what does survival mean? And ultimately, a moral stance was made where a business model enabled that to happen. Because if I'm the chief executive and I've got banks and investors and shareholders breathing down my neck, and I turned around and told the street, hey, payroll's coming first, a reasonable number of those stakeholders would probably push back a bit. So I'm interested in when you have, moral dilemmas starting to come up, is it the wisdom of the crowd that should take over, or is it the moral strength and conviction of the leader that should push on? And we all know where, egotistical, headstrong leaders can get us, both positive and negative. And I'm just interested in exploring, I think, the relationship between morality when others have other ideas. Does hierarchy pull rank? Is it democratized? Like, how should we be thinking about this?
So I think
Can I go?
Yeah, please do.
I actually think it's not between group versus individual power in swaying what is considered moral or what's the right thing to do in a moral dilemma. It's about almost the strength of it's almost the strength of the importance of the problem, and then the strength of the argument that either the individual or the group then takes over. So I don't actually think we can decide whether this is an act of leadership or an act of, if a sufficient amount of people buy into it, it will become de facto the principle according to which we live. I think it's a lot to do with I hear the word character coming out, and I hear the word, what do we actually do as opposed to what do we say we do? So, everybody says in our society, we leave no weak person behind. Like, it's our espoused theory that we say we are a society in which the weak are supported by the strong. But is that really the theory in use? Is that really the practical thing of how we actually make our decisions day to day? I'm not sure that is true. And so I think if we want to talk about morality, we need to talk about what do people think is the right character and the right actions as opposed to the wrong actions. And what I wanted to say before, Matt, you jump in, I think we'll only ever know whether we've had the right priorities. For example, if I am the CEO of this company of 1,000 people, where my highest priority right now is to keep everybody on the payroll, I'll only ever know if it was the right action if later on in life, in the future, I can stand up to judgment, and judgment by, I don't know, it must be somebody whose values codes I respect, to say, yes, that was indeed the right action. So I really keep on thinking that morality and the how-to of making a moral action is to think about how will somebody or a force, and it could be a spiritual or like a moral code of conduct, how will they evaluate my action now in the future? Will I have done the right thing? So it's almost like needing to transport myself into the future to see if I will have made the right decision. Because I forget, was it Matt or Adam who was speaking? You were talking about decisions by yourself and decisions when other people are watching, and I kept thinking about character is what happens when nobody's watching. And we almost want to bring somebody in that we respect to watch us so that we make the right choices, and so that we have the character that we can then in the future say, yeah, this is who I am, this is my identity. I am somebody who doesn't leave anybody behind. And my actions have shown this. Matt, go ahead, please. Sorry.
Yeah, so actually you've kind of almost complicated my thinking, which is great. So when Adam was talking, I was taken back to probably 2008, 2009, when I was speaking to the CEO of one of the world's largest life science tools businesses. And he'd had to make some really difficult decisions of closing down a few, shall we say, nascent parts of the business units. You know, that led to some job losses, but not hundreds and thousands. I mean, not thousands for sure. And, you know, when I'm talking to him about this, so I'm asking, how do you come to that decision? And he said, well, look, this is incredibly difficult. My deepest aim is to grow the business. That's what I want to do. And I want to keep, I don't want to be losing people. I want to be bringing more and more better people in. I want to be providing opportunities. I want to be growing. But I think there's a real grey area. So the company is on the stock market. Therefore, it is a target for other companies. And his moral imperative was for the business and as many of the jobs within the business to survive through a financial crisis, the likes of which many had not seen before. And therefore, the decision, if you were to take the perspective of one of the people that they had to let go, would probably have been an amoral one. We've put all of our blood, sweat and tears into this, and yet we've been had to let go. And yet if you look at those that have survived and several years later, that is likely to have been a good decision because the company's still profitable, it's still viable, and it's still growing. And so the question I think becomes is that I think there's some very obvious black and white moral decisions that we make. And then I think it gets very, very grey in the middle. And I think that's where purpose and, having a guiding light of who we look up to help guide where we, the way that we should make decisions comes into play. If I look at one of the things through sort of Stoicism that I find quite interesting is that not only do do people sort of hold up quotes from famous people, but often you find that you have somebody that you hold up as a moral guide in some ways, that you will then look up to and go, well, what would so and so have done in this situation? People talk about the pros and cons of having statues up and around, and I think one of the things that having a statue around can be is that you can remember, you can almost say to, well, what would so and so have done? And you can actually almost look at them, they're almost overlooking your decisions, your behaviour, and therefore do the statues and the things that we have around us in some ways play a role in helping us to find our moral compasses. I mean, of course, they're not going to judge us, but potentially we can judge ourselves if we have enough self-awareness through the lens of those people that we may have around us. So I find it quite interesting that sort of looking at how is this decision going to be judged in the future. If you take the decisions around the responses to the coronavirus, I think as a great example, if you were to take, over a year ago now, when, the pandemic was starting to spread around the world, but Western countries were still behaving like it wasn't there. If we'd all locked down very, very early, would it have been considered that we were destroying the economy for no good reason? All of a sudden now, we're, in the UK, we've passed 100,000 people that have passed away, which is a horrific number of deaths to have incurred. And maybe the decision was, yes, the economy of course was right to harm, because we wanted to keep it from coming ashore. So I think that there's a lot of decisions where we end up walking some very, very difficult decisions that there is no black or white answer to. And I think that's where the morality of leadership is really difficult to tread. And I think it's where having, as Adam said, a purpose, and this is the reason why we're making these decisions. And if you've got a strong purpose, then I think it really helps to guide the overarching morality of a decision. Whether or not the ultimate decision is any different, it at least explains caveats, puts some rationale behind it in a way that allows you to understand, okay, this is why we're making these decisions. And I think sometimes walking the grey path in the middle can lead us to question, without a clear sense of purpose, can lead to people questioning, actually, what are you doing this right or wrong? Because actually you haven't got a clear guiding light. You're actually kind of following two masters or three, and you're trying to plot a kind of a path between, many many lesser evils.
Yeah. You're definitely touching on, we loop back again to purpose. Unsurprising, yet I think it's going to be the repeating pattern here. But Matt, you've touched on a couple of really interesting points, particularly in relation to trade-off decisions. And if we talk, global pandemic, it's how do governments manage this? Everyone's got their own approach. Who will be deemed better? I saw the Laurie Institute only this week released a paper kind of listing kind of one to forever, the orders of who has done the best job, and best job wasn't necessarily measured by patients or deaths, which I thought was interesting. They've got all these other different variables that they're weighing it up, and it's a very, very nice piece of research. But it's when it comes to those decisions, I think there's a piece around transparency and communication. So let me tell just a quick story here. Recently, when I'm about to fall asleep with a computer on my chest, how I do most evenings, exciting life in lockdown, I am kicking around, going down YouTube rabbit holes, and I came across a video recently by the CEO of a channel called Asian Boss. Props to Asian Boss. They are a channel based out of Asia, and they produce some amazing content. And I've gotten immense value out of them over the years. And the title of the video was something to the effect of "We're about to go broke," or something to this point. And guy sitting on a chair, the CEO, great. So I'm like, okay, let's check this out. Click on it, and this guy basically just opened up and says, look, this is how we started, this is the journey, this is what's happened, here is where we're at, we're only going to ask once, we're asking for the community to underwrite it. Investors have gone bad, we've had to lay off heaps of staff, blah, 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 like we're on the ropes, this is a do or die moment. And I remember watching this video, and a couple of things immediately came forward. All of the work of Amanda Palmer's The Art of Asking. If you haven't read it, read it. It's such a good book, and Amanda Palmer's dope. All lunged forward in relation to being open and honest enough to ask for help when you need it. But it was being asked from a purpose, and this organization's purpose was, we want to produce content that shows different parts of Asia, which is Asian boss, that's their shtick, to bring the stories and show what's around the corner and kind of, show this part of the world to the rest of the world so everyone can have a better understanding. Like, their purpose was sharing knowledge through storytelling, basically. And seeing this CEO go through this 10-minute video, the second thing it reminded me of is the saying, becoming a leader is synonymous with becoming yourself. It's precisely that easy and precisely that difficult. And that's exactly what this guy was doing. He was telling a story from himself, which made him the leader, but he anchored it in purpose. And the purpose is what will bring people along and create the correct moral response. So there's a couple of things there. There's communication, there's authenticity, which we've had a session on. There is transparency. There is also a bit of vulnerability. You're humanizing the decision. And then if you can link that to the purpose. Now, if the purpose in this example is, sharing good stories from a part of the world, or the purpose is to make money, or the purpose is whatever, if the purpose actually speaks to the audience and the delivery of that is correct for the audience and based on the outcome that you're going for, then I think the correct moral decision will become self-evident. So it's an interesting approach. Yeah, Jutta.
I'd love to piggyback off what you've just said, Adam. And by the way, I'm going to come back to repeating what Matt has said about statues and how statues tell us, tell us moral compass. I think that's incredibly beautiful. We have to go there.
Yep.
Staying with this idea of, excuse me, I have to have a click off something. Ugh. Adobe Acrobat, stay away from me. So you said, if I'm transparent and if I can communicate my purpose, then you said the correct, and I'm not sure it's about correct or incorrect, but it fits. People's respond, maybe they go with you, or maybe you are convincing, or you can stand, as a leader you can stand firmly. And I'd like to say, in that process model of thinking that I have of how do I communicate my purpose, before then comes, how do I know what my purpose is? How do I know what my principles or my priorities are? And that's where I think, before even saying the how-to be a moral leader, is to actually become aware of what makes sense to me. And I think we need to bring the body in here. We need to bring in, what does sense making mean? When people say it makes sense, it actually literally makes sense in the body. And so, because we can't tell anybody who's listening or watching how they can define their purpose or what their purpose is, but we can help people work out what makes sense to me. And this is not intellectual. It is actually, it goes into storytelling. Matt did that just now with the statues with us. It goes into almost listening and allowing yourself to receive what makes sense and then feel it in your body. And it's fascinating to me that whenever you say something that literally makes sense in my body tells me, my body starts tingling and my body starts saying, hairs stand up on my neck, right? And so we are much more bottom-up thinkers than we, of course, intellectually think, Cartesian Western world's view of saying it must be right or it must be wrong. But we're not here in morality talking about right or wrong. We're talking about this makes sense and this doesn't make sense. And I have to pick this moral code over that one, even though it's an impossible question to say which one's the right one. And so maybe the request or the invitation that we have for people to work out what their purpose is to listen to the stories of how maybe people before them, in those statues that you speak about, Matt, How have they made sense of the situation? What did they choose? And does that make sense to me? And what fits? And what, what does my gut say about whether that was right or wrong? Because there's no absolute at all. And I think, Matt, you speaking about statues influencing us, that is such an, like right now, it's such an important thing, right? After the Black Lives Matter movement, to actually decide as a collective which statues that are communicating the values and the priorities of the society do we want to have as reminders of what is our culture, what are the norms, and what are the acts that we think are heroic, and what are the acts that we think we do not want to give them a public space. That is so, I think it's beautiful. So it's about storytelling, it's about sense making, and then it's about trusting, right? That I am becoming the leader that I need to become. Adam, you said it so beautifully, like leadership is to become, it's as simple as and as hard as becoming who you were meant to be. And it's in your whole body.
We'll be back in a moment. You're listening to The Strategy Behind.
And I think, just to come back to statues, I don't think that there's any problem at all with having statues that act as a cautionary tale.
Right.
So it's the stories that you have around those statues that's important, So not every statue is there to be celebrated. Some are there to act as a caution. And so I think we have to be careful when we look at what is the purpose of this statue in this place. Are we celebrating the person for things? And I think the other thing that we have to be really careful if we're looking back in history is that our morals have evolved over time. What is acceptable now, even what was acceptable 20 years ago at the turn of the millennium, many of those things are no longer acceptable now. If you look at what was on TV, if you just look at what was on the breakfast TV or the late night TV, you can't get away with that now. You even look at some of the 80s, 90s TV shows. Just take Baywatch, for example. That today would be criticised for objectifying women, for a whole host of things that actually at the time we grew up with, and it was fine. I mean, any of the shows that I grew up with as a kid that were on at TV would actually now we'd have questions about, is this really right or wrong to be showing people? And so I think we evolve because it could be criticised for being on at 5 o'clock and objectifying women. Especially the slow-mo scenes and all of that stuff that's going on. Is that really appropriate for the way that we want to view people in the world? And I think that's a really difficult thing to for us to then be able to look back and go, this was a different time. Okay, it wasn't that long ago, but we have evolved, and what we now think is appropriate has changed. That doesn't mean to say that these things should be banned. And I think when you look at some of the comedy from a while ago, some of that is now being absolutely, people are trying to call for this whole cancel culture for stuff that was done historically and was accepted a long time ago. And now we're saying, well, this is no longer right. And we need to learn that actually our morality progresses as we go forward. And there is something deeply positive about the fact that if somebody says, what I did 20 years ago was acceptable then, and I'm really pleased that it no longer is. And I think that's an incredibly powerful statement to be able to say. But that shouldn't mean you should vilify that person, because culture, the country has moved on. The society, the norms. We celebrated Wall Street, we celebrated the finance sectors during the booms. They were making money for everybody, the stocks and shares, and everybody's going, this is where you make money. And then all of a sudden we get to a crash, and they're pulling the loans, and all of a sudden they're still taking big bonuses, and that's now wrong. And we're going, oh, hang on a second, how can we flip on people so quickly when actually their job is to make money, their purpose is to make money, and not just for themselves, although they're well remunerated for it, but also for our pension funds, the things that we're paying into. And if we didn't do that, we'd be criticising them as well. So I think the world gets so complex that often morality gets difficult to unpick. And so we have to understand, where is the purpose at times for some of these things.
Jutta.
Are you sure? Because I think you're also really
Go
keen
for it.
to jump in. Okay, I'll be really quick.
No,
really quick.
go for it. It's
totally
yours.
love what you said, Matt, and it's and I literally just caught myself as I was saying, Baywatch, not appropriate today. Who am I to say whether Baywatch is appropriate or not? But it really, you talking about how our perception about what's right and wrong, right? We're talking about morality. Morality is about working out what's right and wrong and how that changes over time and depending on context. And the only thing I have as a tool here, as a psychologist, is to keep coming back to this definition of what an emotion is. The function of an emotion is to check whether the person and the situation fits. And whether, the situation and what we're doing in the situation feels right for us. And so it's really interesting to say, like, if I'm now watching a Baywatch episode or the Wolves of Wall Street episode, am I interpreting this in a way that makes sense to me and that fits with where I am, where I'm in society, and then I can watch a Jojo Rabbit movie that makes fun of Nazi Germany as a German, completely understanding that that is a way of dealing with the atrocities that have happened in a way that tells a new story and that involves young people in the absurdity and allows them to make sense of something that they haven't ever even experienced. So it's about working out what fits and what doesn't fit and being true. And maybe I'm throwing the ball back to you, Adam, being transparent about what fits for me personally and why it fits for me.
Yeah, I think it's transparent about not only what fits, but it's also transparent about intent. I think there's something there in relation to the relationship between intent and purpose. Intent is kind of, the what's in it, the self-serving, what's in it for me sort of an approach, which is where skepticism around a moral position starts to arise. Again, it's, to repeat before, the company will always act in its own best interest. But what is its best interest? What is its intent? And then does that intent align to purpose? And it's almost like there's a relationship in relation to the delta between saying something and then doing something. It's, you discredit, the individual or the group who is trying to take a position, a moral stance, when they're saying one thing and doing something else. So there is, when that happens, I think, as someone who is, looking to do the right thing, trying to be, pure of intent, trying to be transparent, is really kind of, laying it all out and going, well, this is the stance we're going to take, and this is the direction we're going, and everyone jumps on board with that. I think trust and support can be lost instantaneously as soon as the actions don't match the words. So I think there is this point around, following through or, having evidence that supports the moral position, I think has to be probably the second step. So one is defining your purpose and the morality around it and your position. And then would be walking the walk. Because if you talk a good game and you don't follow through, then you have a problem. And I would say that large sections of the faith industry, if I may call it that, suffer this. It's like, there's no shortage of religions who have extremist outliers who are very, very small in number, but give the faith of the day, and you can pick from many, very, very bad names. Because the delta between the purpose and the morality and the actions don't match. And I think that's kind of, as a strategist, that's where my brain now starts to go, is how do I actualize morality in a way that builds the credibility to lead?
Oh, yeah. So the credibility is in how much purpose and actions overlap. The more your actions and your intentions or your stated purpose overlap, the more credible you are.
Yeah. Yeah, and obviously the inverse remains true as well, is that the wider the delta, the more your credibility diminishes, which makes sense. You know, if one to be true, the other is also equally true.
And it's also important to have the platform for those to even matter in the first place. And I think that's where social media and some of the things we've seen with political leaders and some business leaders over the last 5 to 10 years as social media has kind of completely transformed the way that people can communicate to a public. That has, that's really shifted things. And so you can be one person on social media, and there's heaps of examples in the US right now where you've got political parties with some pretty extreme people on either side talking about things, and then actually there's a lot of people in the centre that actually are genuinely decent people following a specific purpose. And I think the biggest problem then becomes, and I read a really interesting piece just recently. There's a Republican senator that's about to retire. We're not gonna follow on, and actually saying it's the silence or the inability to stand up that has been that is almost a bigger problem than, shall we say, some of the extremists. Because if you allow people to be given a voice, that's almost a bigger problem. If you don't then come out and say this is against what we believe in, and I think there was an example, and I think it was George W. Bush, and I can't believe that I'm using this as a good example of moral leadership, considering some of the other decisions. But then the world has changed.
How the world
immeasurably.
Changes.
But during it's certainly during one of the Bush eras, there was a particular candidate that was running and was denying of 9/11 and a whole host of things, and the Holocaust and a whole host of stuff. And even though it was their own party, they came out and denounced that person as being not fit for office because of the positions that they were taking on things that were, that were core to the beliefs of the community and therefore their moral standing, to the detriment of their own party. And I think that's where almost the biggest test of morality comes in. It's where, so our purpose may be to rule with a small government, our purpose may be to do this, this and this, but actually our higher purpose is to lead with integrity and to stand up for these few things. And if you can make sure that you're standing up for the things that are really, really important, then actually you do things that may actually hurt you, your career, your party, at least in the short term, by actually standing up against the things that are wrong, the things that don't agree with that thing, with that part of the moral compass. And I think we're seeing at the moment many times where people are kind of getting afraid to take a stand at all unless they're on one side or another. The centrist view is being marginalised massively.
Yeah, completely. It's interesting. So there's a couple of things there. When you were talking about 9/11 deniers, I couldn't help but instantly what jumped forward is Louis C.K. has an amazing piece on Netflix trying to explain 9/11 deniers to his daughter. It's worth checking out. The piece around what I wrote on my notes here, as you said it, is I kind of rephrased it a little bit. I called it the morality vacuum, which is when you have this absence of morality, and it's what replaces it is almost tribalism. If you think about it politically, if you think about like sport, it's some people are happy to abandon their own moral compass to be part of a tribe, to be part of the team, to be part of the party, to be part of whatever. And a different set of criteria comes in. There's power in numbers. I identify with what they're doing, irrespective, or the outcomes, or it's a self-serving agenda, or whatever it happens to be. You've touched on a point there in relation to when morality in oneself can be easily hijacked. And again, this morality vacuum kicks in. I think there's something there, but Matt, also to your follow-on point that you made, is that you touched on purpose there, how you can lift up and go for that higher purpose. Mm-hmm. Now, whether that's in yourself or an external higher purpose or predefined higher purpose. But I'm interested in learning more, and here's what Jutta, I'll throw it to you in relation to the self-sacrificing element for the higher purpose. And I know you've done work with prisons and military and all these sort of things, so I'm quite sure you have something to say in relation to what is that self-sacrificing element to throw yourself under the bus for the higher purpose, for what is deemed a just moral position, and what drives that behavior?
For me, it keeps coming back to short-term versus long-term. And I really like the distinction that you made between, you said intention versus purpose, and I've added in my notes, instrumental intention, intention to get fed, intention, if we're talking about, conflict societies or warfaring countries, where my short-term instrumental intention is to stay alive and to not speak up, right, when an oppressive force tells me to do things that maybe my higher order purpose, my longer term purpose is in conflict with. So where's that delta, and where's and the vacuum, the morality vacuum, I think, gets bigger the more there is a gap between me focusing my attention on my instrumental short-term outcome, and I think I can almost start to discount and sacrifice short-term intention or short-term gain if I really buy into a higher purpose, that in the long run it's the right thing to do to speak up, it's the right thing to do to stand up towards an oppressive force and to do the right thing. The bigger that is, the bigger in my inner order of priorities, and the smaller the importance of the short-term instrumental intention, the more I'm going to act in line with my moral code. And the more I only have second-hand accounts of Nazi Germany, and I have storytellers from genocidal Rwanda at my disposal, but I think it's when people are very, very clear about how they want to be remembered, how they want to have acted in front of somebody judging that they respect, or whose moral code they respect. That's when people choose that path, rather than the short term easy path. Adam.
So what you're almost like, I'm listening attentively, and the way that it's kind of gone into my head is that it's almost a self-actualization / legacy / kind of transcendence sort of a approach. Like, what do I want to be known for after my time? And again, like when I think about the higher up, I don't know, but like a purpose, that becomes very attractive. When I think lower down kind of the structure in relation to more self-serving, I think it gets warped a little bit. I'm not too sure. I'm not too sure.
I think you're completely right there. So, one of the things that the Stoics kind of come into is that almost you could leave life right now. So every day, you wake up. Do you wake up? Do you survive the day? We never know when death is around us, and there's a whole concept around memento mori, so sort of essentially thinking about the fact that you may not, tomorrow may not come for you. And I think with that sort of vision in mind, it makes the decisions you make today in some ways much clearer, because it allows you to say, actually, if I die tomorrow, what do I want to have done? What do I want to have accomplished today? How do I want to be remembered? And that's not going to be, I'm guessing, for the majority of people, for having made a bucket load of money. It's going to have been for having had a positive impact on people. And so it's going to be about actually being able to, I think it's about actually being able to connect and think about the future of how do I want to be remembered, what do I want to be remembered for, and also how do I want to be judged? How am I going to judge myself?
That comes back to your statue point.
Yeah, I like that, but I bristle a little bit. Is it bristle, whatever? A little bit at this self-actualization point, because it's definitely a perspective shift. So Matt, I definitely think you're right in saying the way to get to the right, the code of conduct that is in line with my moral values is to shift perspective away from short-term immediate gain to bigger picture. But I don't think it's in any way as intellectual as a self-actualization, evolved human being perspective. Because from the perspective of my German grandmother giving a sack of potato to a Jewish woman fleeing through the village, it's not an act of self-actualization at all. It's not an act of I want to be remembered for helping out this woman who is starving with her kids. People will not remember that. The thing that's at the forefront of my mind is how can I hide this so that my 4 children will not get killed and taken away alongside with me. And by the same token, the Rwandan coffee farmer who starts to decide to help the person next door whose husband has crushed and has done things that are far too difficult to speak of to her own family, but she starts to decide to help her wash her coffee beans because we're now in it together, and because this is how we're going to make money together, because we're both dirt poor, we both have nothing else to do that helps us. So we're starting to step over short-term grievances, short-term hatred, because it's the right thing to do. But it's not that I am doing anything to make myself be a purer being. It feels right for these women to do the right thing in the moment.
Yeah, absolutely noted. So let me take another swing at it, because I absolutely agree with you. So I didn't mean self-actualization in relation to self-serving. I think same construct, different words. It's kind of like asking yourself, it's kind of the difference between what do I want versus what is good. Like, it's that. That's what I meant by this hierarchy kind of structure that I was using. But if I use it, from a selfish perspective, what is good for me versus what do I want? Both great questions. Both have very different answers. I want the pizza. What's good is going for a jog, and it's that it's it to be right, and that kind of loops back to, if you know it to be right, then I think by default you will have a positive, endorphin release or something from doing the thing. The same way as your grandmother's sack of potato stories. I completely understand that she didn't give it away to be remembered, but my point being is that she remembered, and she has told you, and now you remember. So there is something in there in relation to I did good. There's a pride that comes with it. And maybe that might be a key to kind of unlocking this, which is how can someone act on morality and then receive an emotional kind of kicker out of it? Because then if that becomes a currency that is valued in leadership, suddenly we have a bit of an interesting line into this to kind of go, okay, and this affects this affects all the ESG, it affects the UN kind of, 17, kind of initiatives, it affects government, it affects everyone. If feeling pride or some form of emotive response behind doing what is good for the greater good becomes the self-serving payment, for want of a better form, and that becomes not commoditized, but storytelling, and it becomes a thing, then suddenly I have now a personal motivator to be more moral and be more upstanding based on that moral code, because there's something in it for me. And I'm not saying I'd only do it for a reason in for me, like the potatoes. She didn't do it for her. I can clearly acknowledge that. But her story has lived 80 years. Like, there's something there. And that's worth gold. And that's why I'm kind of trying to find a way into how we can actually foster morality in our leaders and have it be acceptable to make the tough decisions that are the right decisions based on a particular moral construct.
I do agree, although I'm going to also say that I think there's a caution in there as well, is that by chasing a legacy, we can often make bad decisions as well.
Oh, yeah.
So I think it always comes down to that balance of, intent and purpose. And if your intent is to leave a legacy rather than to do good, it's always, it's often going to pervert future decisions. Yeah. And so it's about having that purity of intent almost. And I use the word purity in a way that kind of I feel uncomfortable with anyway, but it's about having something where you're literally, that the intent is to do good. The intent is for something positive to come from this, and the purpose is for that to happen. And if that matches, it feels like it's good. As soon as the intent switches from, well, the purpose is to stop climate change, but I want to do this because I want to be the prime minister that helped save climate change or stop the world from boiling, that kind of that intent goes out the window, and I think you start making bad decisions because of it.
I actually think it's really simple. Listening to you, Matt, now, and to what you just said, Adam, makes it actually quite simple for me. I want to bring in ego and Freud, really simple, and just say, we all know what it smells like when somebody is a bit ego-driven, when somebody does, what is the word? They do value signaling, right? I see this on Twitter and on LinkedIn so much. Have enjoyed so much advising the senior leaders in the Army Defense Corps. It's been such a pleasure to serve you. And that is so not selfless. That is so ego-driven, as opposed to saying, I think I am going to do what's good for the group. I'm going to do something that's good for my family, my community. It transcends the ego. So when things transcend the ego, the whole world accepts it as being constructive. And when things are just for me, I think this is how the whole world has been set up. 2-year-old toddlers help pick up when when another toddler has something heavy to lift, you help them, because we're designed to be made for the community, for something that's bigger than ourselves. But when we're just about ourselves, when we are protecting our ego in any shape or form, that morality, that code of conduct that has character, is not going to happen. Is it not that simple?
So what you're saying is ego is the enemy.
Ego is the enemy. That's the conclusion, I think.
Ego is the enemy. I love it. I absolutely.
And I'm not stealing that horrifically from Ryan Holiday by any way, shape, or form.
I was going to say, it's like... I think the big thing that kind of really landed in this conversation for me is Matt's point about statues. That's interesting. And if I think about how it's been kind of actualized, at least what I've seen, you have people, they put up little pin boards and they put pictures of the people that they've, their aspiration board. Oh, here's a picture of this person, there's a picture of that person. It's there is attributes in these individuals, whether they're current, past, whatever, that you aspire to adopt and become. And the statue analogy is, I think, of the same construct of just how much credibility having an eye over your shoulder, whether it be a statue, a picture on a wall, but the respect is there. Respect is the currency that exists between the eyes and your action. And if you can go to bed at night knowing that you've done the right thing by that, then you're probably staying somewhat close to your morals. That's what I've taken away.
I adore that too. I'm going to give you the last word, Matt, because we're right now. I want to expand on how much I respect and adore this stories. The stories whispered in our ears through the statues, because that then comes to the distinction between what you said, Adam, what I want versus what's good for me. The statue or these eyes tell me where I need to go. Matt, sorry.
And I'll agree with you, and I think the only thing I really want to add is I guess that is then why there is so much media interest in the statues or the busts that US presidents decide to display in the White House. And you'll see, we've put the Winston Churchill bust up, or we've taken it down, or we've moved it, and all of a sudden it's saying, well, who actually is looking over our shoulders? And I think that becomes a really interesting thing, and it becomes quite telling when you have big shifts from one president to another, and all of a sudden the decor is changed, the busts are changed, and you realise that actually these are there's a lot of signalling as to who do we respect that comes from that.
Yeah, it's absolutely, because if you use Winston as an example, there is no shortage of people who think he's an absolute scumbag. So it's context dependent, which is ironic because I'm currently holding a Churchill War Rooms pen. And it's on that note that we will close out the session. The strategy behind morality in leadership. I've worked for my money, this one. This is good. It's a tough one to crack, but I think we've inched it forward. And I'm sure there will be more episodes to come soon enough. Subscribe, do all those things you meant to do.
Adam Cox is a trusted strategic advisor to leaders, executives and organisations across the globe. Dr. Jutta Tobias Mortlock is a social psychologist who researches and advises on how to help people at work be and do well. Dr. Matt Wilkinson is a marketing strategist and educator who helps life science and tech companies bring disruptive products and brands to market.